Greetings, humans, and anyone else who might be watching. I present to you the specialized Chisel Evo. I've talked about the Chisel before, but that was the Chisel Hardtail, back when it was just called the Chisel. My understanding of the backstory, as I watched it unfold, was 2024, Specialized came out with the new version of the Epic 8. Came in two versions, Standard and Evo, as they've done with previous generations. The difference being a 120 millimeter travel fork Standard and a 130 millimeter travel fork on the Evo. Everything else is the same. Real travel on those bikes is 120 millimeters. They're both a flex tail, flex seat stay, essentially linkage driven single pivot design, and the frames are the same. Now it was a question whether they would release an aluminum version. They've had aluminum Epics in the past, but they didn't seem to be doing that. And then a little while after, they released the Chisel FS, which quickly just became the Chisel, and the Chisel Hardtail became the Chisel HT, Chisel Hardtail. You still see both naming systems being used. This is still called the Chisel FS some places, but basically they seem to be just calling it the Chisel now. And when they launched this, they said basically this is based on the same kinematics as the Epic. It is a high performance, lightweight, aluminum full suspension that's designed to bring a lot of the performance of the Epic in a less expensive metal version. And when I first saw this, I was like, yes, this is the bike that I think a lot of other people have been dreaming of. I've been really into metal full suspension for quite a while. I've built a couple of steel full suspensions that are just a simple single pivot, more like a Starling style. Loved them, but in researching what I was going to do, I came across the Swarf, which is kind of a similar design to this, a linkage driven single pivot with flex seat stays. And I also came across, then later Reeb came out with their steel flex tail full suspension. And I think these bikes are rad, but they're all pretty expensive, boutique. And so this is a mass market. Anyone can get this. It's a relatively inexpensive bike, and it is really light for what it is. And I'll go into some of the geometry in a minute, but just stepping back and looking at what you get with this, it's a DSW frame, so the D'Aluzio Smartwell. The seat tube is all heavily formed, bottom bracket and the pivots are formed into that tube. The actual pivots and the bottom bracket shell are inserted into that. Beautiful, shapely top tube, much like the Chisel Hardtail, but a little bit beefed up. Heavily formed head tube, just gorgeous seat stays that go down UDH, really nicely shaped chain stays. The whole thing is just really beautifully made. I especially love this bridge up here by the rear shock linkage. The main differences between this and the Epic are this only has 110 millimeters of travel in the back. Still the same up front, 120 for the Standard, 130 for the Evo. And it has 5 millimeters shorter reach. So in the low position, in the Evo configuration, it's 465, non-Evo 470 reach for this size large. The same size large in an Epic is 470 and 475 respectively for those two configurations. So just a little bit shorter for the Chisel. It also has a little bit steeper head tube angle. So this one, depending on the flip chip position, which it does have a flip chip in the shock here, high and low, head tube angle can range, depending on Evo, non-Evo, flip chip position, high, low, it can range from about 66.5 degrees down to about 66 degrees, depending on what configuration you've got it in. Seat tube angle is around 75. So in the non-Evo high position, it gets up to Specialized claims 75.5. I'm not actually sure where they're measuring that to. In the drawings, they show it to here. But in my measurements, from the center of my seat post clamp to the center of the cranks with my saddle height, you know, at 800 millimeters to the top of the saddle, in this Evo setup with a high shock setting, I've got 75 degrees. So, and that's something I think really I'd like to kind of stay on for a second with this, because I got to ride the Epic 8 Evo shortly after it came out, and I know it was set up in the low position, but I was really slamming my seat forward. And given around here, have a lot of extended, pretty steep climbs, so it's a place that really lends itself well to either a hardtail or kind of the modern super steep C-tube enduro style, just kind of like elevator bike. This is neither of those. And it's really interesting because I've kind of ridden a wave in terms of what I think about the C-tube angle on this. Initially, with the shock in the low position, with my saddle centered on the rails, I just felt like I was sitting down too much, like it just felt too slack. Slamming the seat forward, slowly changing setup, raising the shock to the high position, it feels good, but I use the lockout. I use the lockout on extended climbs. I think what I've realized about this bike is it's a cross-country bike, and that means more rolling terrain. That means if you hit something steep, you're probably going to be standing up and jamming. And that's where it really seems happiest, and the suspension works really well for that. It's got a nice amount of anti-squat, definitely bobs a bit, but basically if you stand up and hammer, it feels really solid. It just goes. It does absorb bumps still, but it's definitely feels very efficient. And that just seems like how it wants to be ridden. The seat tube angle isn't so steep that if you're hammering out of the saddle and you hit some bumps, the seat doesn't hit you. Like on these really steep enduro bikes, if you go over some technical section while you're climbing, you got to drop your seat so that it doesn't like buck you off the bike. This is not like that. You know, this is a bike I can remotely imagine riding with a rigid seat post. I wouldn't recommend it, but I think it could be done. And so, even though I think one of my complaints with this bike has really been like maybe the seat tube angle is a little slacker than I'd like it, it really does make sense. For this, where I'm located with its long, steep climbs where you do tend to sit and just kind of like spin them out, sometimes it can feel a little slack, but I get where they're coming from, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So I've definitely kind of run the gamut on that. Overall, you know, as far as the suspension goes, it's really interesting. It is very, very supple. And when I switched the flip chip, I think I saw part of why that is. As you're extending the shock to full extension here, you're actually bending the rear triangle a little bit. I think you're probably closing it a little bit. And that effectively, I think, tensions it and actually helps reduce the breakaway force, because it actually wants to come unstretched a little bit. So it feels super smooth, like supple off the top. And I think the same is probably one of the reasons that this bike is not super easy to bottom out. Probably the flexing of the triangle actually has something to do with its bottom out resistance, because I've been really impressed. You can ride it pretty hard. I mean, you know, I'm riding like a cross-country bike. I'm not doing huge drops, not doing huge jumps, but I'm having fun on it. I'm going fast. I am not shying away from most things, and it really doesn't bottom out easily. That said, this RockShox Deluxe Select Plus shock feels like it's a little simplistic in its valving, and that's something I wish they would do differently on these bikes. On all the Chisels, unless I'm misremembering, but at least all the Evos, including the Epics, they use a two-position locked open shock, like, you know, locked position and an open position. And this is a bike that I think would really, really benefit from a three-position shock. I think that middle position where it's got some support but it still has the ability to go through its travel a bit, be a bit active, would really, really work well with this design. It's one of those ones where maybe you're doing an extended climb, you're mostly wanting it pretty firm, but you do want it to still absorb bumps. You don't want to have to like unlock it, you know, if you're going through a little rough section. I think that would just work really well in this. And so with the Epics, the non-Evo versions do come with that kind of a shock, but they all have remotes. I don't like the extra complication of a remote, especially when it's remote that's going to the fork and the shock. I just don't love it. But, you know, I think that might be a better configuration. And it's interesting because, you know, reading some reviews of the Epics, really after I got this, you know, some people have said, you know, the geometry really seems best suited to the non-Evo version. And a number of, I mean, some of the reviews that I've read of the Epic Evos have been that the Evo just doesn't seem like it's the most well sorted. And I might be inclined to agree with that. That said, I do think once you get an Evo version into the high shock setting, it kind of balances it out quite a bit, and it brings the geometry back to a much more manageable place. It does raise the bottom bracket a little bit, but it doesn't seem like it's so much that it's a terrible thing. So, you know, other big differences between this and the Epic: no SWAT box on this, obviously, and it's heavier. This is about, I think they claim 2,900 grams. I want to say this was 3,000 grams. I weighed it with the, I think I have headset in there, C-post clamp, through axle, derailleur hanger, bolts. This complete bike, as it's here, it's 29 pounds, pretty much on the money. It's not a super light build. It's not a super heavy build, but, you know, it's a full-size non-step cast 34 fork. It's a GX XO Trubative crank, carbon crank mix Eagle build. You know, fairly light, but not the lightest. I've got carbon bars, but, you know, a basic Ritchie stem. You know, it's light, but it's not crazy light, and I feel like that's a totally reasonable weight. And so I'm super impressed, and it's really hard to show here, but this, the frame only finish is just stunning. It's so cool looking. This pink, it's kind of semi-clear. It's got kind of a brushed look underneath it. It's very cool. So who's this bike for? I think it's for someone who doesn't want to get super gnarly, but who wants to be able to ride everything, and who likes to go fast, who likes to climb, and doesn't feel like they need to hit the really big jumps. You know, if you're in a place that is really descent focused with just big hucking as the big thing, this probably isn't what you're going to be wanting to ride with your friends with, because your friends are probably all on, you know, 150 to 170 millimeter bikes, and they're just wanting to hit the big lines. That said, you know, the geometry of this, I feel like, is pretty dialed, so you can hit the slightly smaller lines and really still, you know, it spices them up enough, but it's super smooth. The suspension is really, really active, really supple, and pretty well controlled. I think the shock could be better, like I said, but overall really well controlled. It is a single pivot, so you do get some brake jack. You know, the rear end firms up noticeably when you put the brakes on, which is always a bummer, but that's just kind of something you get with single pivot. And you lose some weight, so it's a trade-off. So I think I'll talk about the build maybe in another video, but I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview of what I think of this bike after riding it for a few months. And, you know, I realize I had a couple videos of Specialized bikes. Don't mean to seem like a Specialized fanboy, but these Smartweld bikes I think are really, really cool. Very accessible prices for kind of amazing metal. And, you know, Specialized talks about this as speed metal. It is fast and it is metal. It is a very cool bike, and I think it's a great value. I really, you know, looking at the different builds that this is available in as a complete, I really like the Evo Comp build for 2025. It comes with a Fox 34 with a Grip 2 damper, which is one of the greatest dampers in my experience. Fox float in the back, It comes with a crummy cassette, you know, it's got some issues, but overall it's a pretty solid build for the price. And I just think this seems like a bike that, for doing all sorts of things. I think bike packing, this would be a great bike packing bike too. It's a pretty sweet bike. It doesn't feel like they've made this into just like a bad aluminum copy of an Epic. This is truly a cool metal cross-country bike that is high performance. It is aimed at a little lower price bracket, but it doesn't feel like the finish quality is bad. It's beautifully constructed, and yeah, it feels nimble, it climbs great, it descends really well. It is not a smasher and plow kind of bike, but it is a super fun cross-country bike. And, you know, and I think you get that at a really low weight overall. So I'm really impressed. I'm really stoked to see a company doing this, like putting some engineering into a cool metal bike that is relatively affordable for a mountain bike these days. So kudos to Specialized for doing it. I mean, you know, it's a cool bike. So do you have any questions about it? Let me know. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you'd like to know. Yeah, have fun out there. Like and subscribe.